The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning, and Gerald Whitmore read it twice before he smiled. Not the smile of a relieved man, the smile of a man who had just figured out how to use someone else's pain to save his own skin. He folded the paper carefully, walked to the parlor where his eldest daughter sat mending a blouse she'd already mended 3 times, and said without looking at her, "You're leaving for Wyoming on Friday." Evelyn looked up. "I beg your pardon?" "Your sister isn't going." He set the telegram on the table between them like it was a deed of sale. "You are." She stared at him, then at the telegram, then at the man she had called father for 31 years, and she understood, with the sick, hollow clarity of someone who has always suspected the worst, that she had never been a daughter to him. She had always been a backup plan. But if this story already has you gripped, don't move. Subscribe to this channel right now, hit that like button, and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And trust me, you do not want to miss what happens next. The photograph had been Clara's idea. She'd spent an entire afternoon in front of the mirror adjusting the angle of her chin, softening her expression just enough to look approachable without appearing desperate. The photographer on Beacon Street had called her a natural. She'd paid extra for 2 copies, one for the agency, one for herself, to keep as proof that she was, in fact, as lovely as she believed. That photograph had traveled from Boston to a small Wyoming ranch, tucked against the eastern base of the Laramie Mountains, and it had arrived in the rough, calloused hands of a man named Colton Hayes on a Wednesday afternoon in late March, 1881. Colton was not a man who spent much time with photographs. He'd held it by the edge, like he was afraid to smudge it, and studied it for longer than he'd planned. Clara Whitmore, age 24, educated, domestically skilled, willing to relocate. He'd set the photograph on the table next to his coffee and said nothing for a while. His ranch hand, a bow-legged man named Pete Greer, who'd worked the property since before Colton's uncle died, leaned over to look. "She's real pretty, boss." "I know." "That a good thing or a bad thing?" Colton picked up his coffee. "I don't know yet." He wasn't looking for pretty. He'd learned early that pretty had a short shelf life on the frontier. What he needed was someone who could work, who wouldn't shatter the first time a hard winter hit, who understood that survival wasn't romantic and the land didn't care about feelings. But he had also been alone for 6 years, and there were nights, long silent nights, when the wind came down off the mountains and rattled the windows, when the loneliness had weight to it, like something physical pressing against his chest. He'd sent the $500 to the Boston agency 2 weeks later. That money had taken him the better part of a year to save. What? Gerald Whitmore received the agency's payment on a Thursday. By Sunday, it was gone. He was not a dishonest man by nature. That was what he told himself, and had been telling himself for so long that he almost believed it. He was a man who had made poor decisions in difficult circumstances, which was an entirely different thing. The card tables on Commercial Street did not distinguish between the two, but Gerald found the distinction personally important. The $500 disappeared into a debt that had been following him like a shadow for 8 months. There was brief relief, the kind that lasts about as long as it takes to walk home from the gambling house, and then the relief curdled into the familiar sick awareness that he had done something he could not undo. He could not send Clara to Wyoming. Claire had made that plain the moment she understood what a Wyoming ranch actually meant, not the romantic notion of open sky and adventure, but the reality of isolation, labor, and a man she'd never met who needed a working partner more than a wife. "I won't go," Claire had said, folding her arms. "Father, I won't. There must be another arrangement." She was beautiful, and she knew it, and she had always known that beauty, in the right circumstances, was its own form of currency. She was not going to spend it on a scarred rancher in the middle of nowhere when there were perfectly acceptable men in Boston with warm houses and reasonable hours. Gerald had looked at his younger daughter and understood completely. Then he turned and looked at Evelyn. Evelyn, who had never given him trouble. Evelyn, who had run his household since her mother died 8 years ago, who kept the accounts balanced and the pantry organized, and who had never once, not once, asked for anything in return. Evelyn, who was 31 and plain-spoken and solidly built, and whose society had quietly agreed was unlikely to do better than whatever someone was willing to offer her. The calculation took him approximately 4 seconds. "Evelyn," he said, She looked up from the account ledger. She was always working on something. "There's an opportunity I need to discuss with you." She said no. That surprised him, which surprised her because she had spent most of her life being treated as someone who didn't have the standing to refuse anything. "I'm not Clara," she said. "The man paid for Clara. Sending me would be dishonest. It would be practical. Those aren't the same thing." Gerald leaned against the doorframe and looked at his eldest daughter with an expression she recognized. Not cruelty exactly, but the particular coldness of someone calculating how much pressure to apply. "You have no prospects here," he said. "I have a life here. You have a function here. That's different." He picked up the telegram from the table. "I have debts, Evelyn. Serious ones. If I can't resolve this matter, we lose the house. All of us. You, Clara, everything your mother worked for." She went very still. "And your solution," she said slowly, "is to ship me to Wyoming under your younger daughter's name. My solution is to give you a chance you would never otherwise have." That's a remarkable way to describe fraud. He didn't flinch. That was the worst part. He just looked at her with that patient, reasonable expression and said, "The man needs a wife. You need a home. This solves both problems. I don't see why you're making it complicated." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about the household she had managed without thanks. She thought about the years she had listened to Clara being praised for her appearance, while Evelyn's competence was treated as simply what was expected. She thought about being 31 in a city that had already decided she didn't matter. Then she thought about Wyoming. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no again either. And Gerald Whitmore, who had always known exactly which silences to interpret as surrender, smiled and said, "Good, I'll arrange the tickets." The train left Boston on a Friday morning. Evelyn sat with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap and watched her city disappear through the window, with the feeling of someone who has jumped from a height and hasn't yet decided if it was a mistake. She had brought 3 things she considered essential: a ledger she used for personal accounts, a letter she'd written to herself the night before outlining every reason this was a terrible idea, and a small, worn copy of her mother's recipe book that she had no practical reason to take but couldn't leave behind. She had not brought the photograph. She'd considered it. The copy Clara had kept, the one that would tell Colton Hayes exactly what his intended bride looked like. She'd held it in her hands the morning she packed, and then set it back on Clara's dressing table. If she was going to do this thing, she was going to do it as herself. That decision felt brave for approximately 48 hours. By the time the train crossed into Nebraska, with the landscape flattening into something she had no words for, brave had started to feel a great deal like foolish. A woman in the seat across the aisle, 50s, weathered face, the kind of hands that had done real work, caught Evelyn staring out the window with an expression that must have been transparent. "First time west?" the woman asked. "Is it that obvious?" "You've got the look." The woman smiled, not unkindly, like you've swallowed something and you're not sure yet if it agrees with you. That's accurate. "Where you headed?" "Wyoming, a place called Bitter Creek." The woman's smile didn't disappear exactly. It just changed character, became more complicated. "Ranching country." "Yes." "You got family out there?" Evelyn considered the question. "Not yet," she said finally. The woman nodded slowly, like that answer meant something she'd heard before. "Well," she said, "Wyoming doesn't care much about where you came from. It mostly just wants to know what you're made of." Evelyn turned back to the window. "I suppose I'm about to find out," she said. Bitter Creek Station was smaller than she'd expected and louder. There was a group of men on the platform. Ranchers, she guessed, from the cut of their clothes and the way they stood, like people who spent most of their time outdoors and had stopped caring what they looked like. A few women. A child chasing a dog between the legs of adults who ignored it. Evelyn stepped off the train with her bag in one hand and her composure in the other, and she stood on that platform for a moment in the late afternoon light, in the enormous open air of a place that had no comparison to anything she'd ever seen, and she felt, for just a second, something that was almost like possibility. Then she saw him. She knew it was him because he was standing apart from the others, and because he was looking at the train with an expression of barely contained tension, the face of a man who has been waiting for something important and doesn't know yet if it's going to disappoint him. He was taller than she'd expected, broader. The scar that ran along the left side of his jaw had faded to a pale line that she suspected he'd stopped noticing years ago. He held his hat in his hands, turning the brim, which she recognized as a nervous habit even in strangers. He was looking for someone who looked like the photograph. His eyes moved across the platform, scanning, and they passed over Evelyn twice before he seemed to register that she was looking directly at him. His gaze stopped. Something shifted in his expression. Not recognition, but the beginning of an unpleasant suspicion. Evelyn walked toward him before she could stop herself. Every step felt like a decision. "Mr. Hayes," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "My name is Evelyn Whitmore." He stared at her. "I'm looking for Clara Whitmore." "I know. She was supposed to be on this train." "She isn't." His jaw tightened. "Where is she?" "Boston. She decided not to come." Evelyn met his eyes because she had promised herself she would not look away. "I'm her older sister. My father, he sent me instead. He used your money to pay a debt, and rather than return it, he arranged for me to come in Clara's place." The silence that followed had physical dimensions. She watched him absorb it. She watched the confusion become anger, and the anger become something harder, a cold, settling fury that was somehow worse than an explosion. "You knew," he said. Not a question. "I knew when I boarded the train. I didn't know before that." "And you came anyway." "I had nowhere else to go." She kept her voice even. "That's the honest answer. I wish I had a better one." He put his hat back on his head. He looked away from her, across the platform to where several of the men had stopped pretending not to watch. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice low and controlled in the way that suggested control was costing him something. "I don't know what arrangement your family made, but I didn't agree to it. I paid for a specific woman and a specific agreement, and you are not that woman." "No," she said, "I'm not." "The next train east comes through Thursday." "I know." "I suggest you be on it." He turned and walked away without looking back, and Evelyn stood on the platform of Bitter Creek Station with her single bag and the sound of men laughing. Quiet, derisive laughter, the particular kind reserved for someone who has just been publicly humiliated. And she did not cry. She had not cried in front of anyone since her mother's funeral. She was not about to start now. The only hotel in Bitter Creek was a 2-story building called the Territorial, which was a generous name for what was essentially a boarding house with ambitions. The woman who ran it, a wide-faced, efficient widow named Ruth Alcott, looked Evelyn up and down when she appeared at the desk and said, "You're the one from the station. News travels fast. Bitter Creek's small." Ruth pulled out a register. "You want a room or not?" "For a few days, yes." Ruth quoted a price that was slightly more than it should have been. Evelyn recognized it as a test of some kind and paid it without negotiating, which seemed to satisfy Ruth in a way that negotiating might not have. "Dining rooms at 6 and 7, Ruth said. "Don't be late, and don't let any of the men from the cattle operations give you trouble. If they do, you tell me and I'll handle it." "I can handle my own trouble." Ruth looked at her again, this time with slightly more interest. "Can you?" "I've had practice." Something in Ruth's expression shifted toward the beginning of respect. She handed Evelyn a key. "Room 4, end of the hall. It's the quietest one." She did not sleep well. The room was clean enough and the bed was adequate, but the sounds were wrong, unfamiliar in the particular way of a place that has its own rhythms you haven't yet learned to filter. Wind, horses, men talking somewhere below, their words indistinct, their laughter carrying through the floorboards. She lay in the dark and thought about Thursday. She thought about going back to Boston, to her father's house, where she would resume her function as the invisible machinery that kept everything running, where Clara would eventually find a suitable man and get married, and Evelyn would be handed down to the next generation of the family as a kind of useful fixture. She thought about her mother, who had been a practical woman and who had told Evelyn once, the winter before she died, that the worst thing a person could do was mistake comfort for safety. At some point she must have slept because she woke to gray light and the sound of a rooster objecting to the morning. She sat up. She washed her face with water from the basin. She looked at herself in the small spotted mirror above the dresser. 31 years old, tired, 500 miles from everything she knew. She was not going home on Thursday. She hadn't known it until that moment, but she knew it then with the certainty of something that has always been true and just needed the right silence to become audible. She had nowhere to go back to. Not really. The house wasn't home. It was a place she maintained. The life wasn't hers. It was a service she provided. She had come to Wyoming under someone else's name and been rejected before she'd spoken a complete sentence, and it had still been more honest and experienced than 31 years of being treated as background. She braided her hair, put on her second-best dress, and went downstairs to see what the dining room had for breakfast. She was eating oatmeal and reading the county land records she'd found in a pile of papers Ruth kept on the front desk. "Help yourself," Ruth had said, without asking why she wanted them. When the door opened and 3 men came in, loud with the particular confidence of people who own things. The man in the center was not physically remarkable. Medium height, soft in the way of someone who had once been strong and had since paid other people to be strong for him. He wore a good suit that cost real money, and he looked around the dining room with the habitual assessment of a man who catalogs everything by its usefulness to him. This, Evelyn would later learn, was Marcus Voss. At the time, she just noticed that he looked at her the way certain kinds of men look at women they've already decided don't matter. A glance, a categorization, a dismissal, all in less than 2 seconds. She returned to the land records. She heard him stop near her table. "You're the bride," he said, the way you'd say, "You're the stray that got in." "I'm a guest of this hotel," she said, without looking up. "You're the woman Hayes sent back." She turned a page. "The oatmeal here is very good. I'd recommend it." Silence. Then, from one of the men behind him, a short, mean laugh. "Well," Marcus said, his voice carrying for the benefit of the room, "I suppose Hayes has enough problems without adding another one to his household." He walked past her to a table near the window. Evelyn kept her eyes on the land records, kept her expression neutral, and quietly catalogued his voice, his tone, and the way the room had subtly arranged itself around him. She'd worked with men like this in Boston, men who operated through implication, who used public humiliation as a management tool, who expected women to shrink. She continued reading. Colton Hayes, she noticed, owned the water rights to Clearwater Creek, and the terms under which those rights were held were considerably more interesting than anything else in the county records. She found him at the livery stable that afternoon. He was working on a harness, his back to the door, and he didn't turn around when she came in, though she was reasonably certain he heard her. "I'm not leaving Thursday," she said. He kept working. "That's your choice. I wanted you to know, in case it changes anything." "It doesn't." "All right." She stayed where she was. "I also wanted to say that I looked at the county land records this morning. I know that probably seems intrusive, but I noticed your water rights documentation has an error in the original filing. There's a date discrepancy that could be used against you in court if someone wanted to challenge it." That made him turn. He looked at her with an expression that wasn't quite hostile anymore, but wasn't anything warmer either. The expression of someone who has been surprised by the wrong person. "How do you know about water rights filings?" he said. "I worked as an accountant for a land development firm in Boston for 4 years. She held his gaze. "I also know that Marcus Voss's cattle operation filed a competing claim on Clearwater Creek 6 weeks ago." Something changed in his face. Fast, then controlled. "Where did you see that?" "It's in the county records, public record. He filed it quietly, but it's there." He set the harness down. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time, not with the anger of betrayal or the discomfort of a man who doesn't know what to do with the situation, but with the focused attention of someone who has just received information that matters. "Why are you telling me this?" he said. Evelyn considered the question. "Because," she said, "you are about to lose something important and you don't know it yet. And I may not be the woman you paid for, but I'm still a person standing in front of you, and I'm telling you the truth." She paused. "I've found that telling the truth is generally more useful than not telling it, even when people don't particularly want to hear it." He stared at her. She waited. He picked the harness back up, then set it down again, then looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What else was in those records?" he said. And Evelyn Whitmore, who had been sent to Wyoming in place of her sister, who had been rejected on a train platform, who had eaten oatmeal alone in a hotel dining room while a powerful man dismissed her in front of a room full of people. She almost smiled. "Quite a lot," she said. "Do you have somewhere we can sit?" They sat in the back corner of the livery stable, on an overturned feed crate and a three-legged stool that Colton had wedged against the wall to keep from tipping. It was not a comfortable arrangement. The smell of hay and horse was heavy in the air, and somewhere in the far stall a mare was shifting her weight with the restless patience of an animal that has learned to wait. Evelyn opened the ledger she'd brought from her room. She'd spent the previous evening copying out the relevant entries from the county records in her own hand, organized by date, cross-referenced by name. It was the kind of work she did naturally, without thinking about it, the same way some people drummed their fingers or chewed their lips. Colton looked at the ledger, then at her. "You did all this last night?" "I couldn't sleep." He almost said something. She could see it, the beginning of a response that he pulled back. He looked down at the page instead. "Walk me through it," he said. So she did. The water rights to Clearwater Creek had been in Colton's family, specifically his late uncle, Douglas Hayes, since 1873. The original claim was filed correctly, properly recorded, but the renewal documentation from 1878 had a transcription error. The parcel number was off by a single digit, which created a technical gap in the legal chain of title, a gap that Marcus Voss's attorney had quietly identified. "His competing claim is dated February 14th of this year," Evelyn said, pointing to the entry. "It doesn't use your parcel number. It uses the corrected parcel number, the one your filing should have had, which means if this ever goes before a judge, Voss could argue your claim was never properly established, and his is the only valid one on record." Colton was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man who wasn't following, the quiet of a man following too well and not liking where it was going. "My uncle renewed that filing himself," he said. "I was 17. I didn't know anything about it. The error wasn't yours, but it's yours to fix now." She turned the page. "Or not fix, depending on what happens in the next few weeks." He looked up. "What does that mean?" "It means," Evelyn said carefully, "that Voss filed that claim in February, and according to the county calendar, the next property claims review session is in 43 days. If your rights aren't correctly established before then, his claim automatically advances to consideration." She paused. "And I also noticed in the bank's lending records, which are public record, though the clerk seemed surprised I wanted them, that you have an outstanding loan from Voss's bank, Frontier Territorial. Yes, with a balloon provision I'd describe as deliberately obscure." Colton rubbed the back of his neck. It was a gesture, she would come to learn, that meant he was angry but was choosing not to show it. "I know about the loan. I didn't know about the balloon." "Most borrowers don't until it's too late to do anything about it." She closed the ledger. "He's done this to at least 3 other ranchers in the county, from what I can tell. I'd need to look more carefully to be sure." He was staring at her now in a way that had changed quality entirely from the stare on the train platform. That one had been cold and locked. This one was something else. The expression of a man recalibrating, a man who has been operating on one set of assumptions and has just been handed information that makes those assumptions dangerous. "Why are you doing this?" he said. Not hostile, just direct. The kind of question that wants a real answer. Evelyn thought about how to answer honestly without sounding like she was asking for something. "I am a woman who arrived in this town under false pretenses," she said. "The only thing I have to recommend myself is that I know what I'm looking at when I read a financial document. If I sit in that hotel room waiting for Thursday and doing nothing, I'm just a problem that happened to you. If I make myself useful, I'm at least—" She stopped. "I'm at least something." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You said 3 other ranchers." "At least 3, possibly 5. The pattern is consistent enough that it's not coincidence." "Can you prove it?" "Not yet, but I think I can." But he didn't ask her to stay. He didn't invite her to the ranch or offer any arrangement or suggest that Thursday's train could be ignored. He stood up from the feed crate, put his hat on, and said, "I need to think." in the tone of a man who actually needed to think and wasn't using it as a polite dismissal. Evelyn walked back to the territorial alone. Ruth was behind the front desk when she came in and watched her cross the lobby with the careful attention of a woman who notices things. "How'd it go?" Ruth said. Evelyn stopped. "I beg your pardon?" "With Hayes. I saw you heading toward the livery." Ruth was polishing a lamp globe with a cloth, unhurried. "That man's been fighting Marcus Voss for 2 years without knowing he's in a fight. It's painful to watch." Evelyn studied Ruth Alcott for a moment. The competent hands, the steady eyes, the manner of someone who had survived things and come out the other side with very clear opinions about what mattered. "You know about the water rights dispute?" Evelyn said. "Honey, I know about everything in this town. I just mostly keep it to myself." Ruth set down the lamp globe. "What I want to know is what you plan to do about it." "I'm not sure anyone has asked me to do anything about it." "No, but you're going to anyway, aren't you?" It wasn't quite a question. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "I suppose I am," she said. Ruth picked up another lamp globe. "Room 4 is paid through Sunday," she said. "After that, we can discuss terms." Colton Hayes did not sleep well that night either, though for different reasons than Evelyn. He lay in the bunkhouse. He'd given the main bedroom to Pete years ago when Pete's knee got bad, and the stairs became a problem. And he stared at the ceiling and thought about everything the woman had said in his livery stable in a voice that didn't waver once. He thought about the balloon provision in the loan. He thought about the water rights filing, the date discrepancy he'd never known to look for. He thought about Douglas Hayes, his uncle, who had left him the ranch not out of generosity, but out of a lack of better options, and who had apparently also left him a filing error that could cost him everything. He thought about his birthday, June 20th, 42 days away. His uncle's will had been specific and, in Colton's opinion, insane. The full inheritance, the ranch, the water rights, the land patents, would only transfer legally to Colton if he was a married man by his 32nd birthday. It was a condition Douglas had added in the last year of his life, driven by some late-stage conviction that a bachelor couldn't properly steward a working ranch. The ranch had been run by a trust administered by Frontier Territorial Bank in the interim. Frontier Territorial Bank. Marcus Voss's bank. Colton had always understood the inheritance clause as inconvenient. He was beginning to understand it differently now, as a deliberate mechanism. If he failed to marry by June 20th, the trust would liquidate the property and the bank would absorb the debts. He'd sent for a bride because he needed a wife to meet the legal condition. He'd believed it was simple: pay the agency, receive the woman, file the marriage, secure the inheritance. He had not considered that the woman might not arrive. He had not considered what he'd do with 42 days and no options. He sat up at 2 in the morning and went outside and stood in the dark and the cold, which was still sharp in May, and he breathed in the air of the land he'd worked for 6 years and thought about losing it. Then he thought about Evelyn Whitmore, sitting in his livery stable on a 3-legged stool, telling him the truth with a ledger in her lap. He went back inside and did not sleep, but he made a decision. Okay. She was at breakfast again when he came in. Same table, different ledger. She'd apparently acquired another one from somewhere. She was writing quickly, not eating, though there was a cup of coffee going cold at her elbow. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. She looked up. "I need you to understand something first," he said. "I'm going to say something practical, and I need you to hear it as practical and not as anything else." She set her pen down. "All right. I have 42 days to be legally married or I lose the ranch." She blinked. Just once. "The inheritance clause. You know about it. It was in the trust documentation at the county office. I wasn't sure if you knew about the timeline." "I knew about the clause. I didn't know about Voss's competing water rights claim until yesterday." He put his hands flat on the table. "I'm not a man who asks for help easily. I want to be clear about that." "I noticed. And I'm not a man who offers things he doesn't mean. So what I'm about to say, I mean." He looked at her directly, the way he looked at everything, without flinching, without cushioning. "I need a wife. You need a place to be. If you're willing to marry me, I'll give you a home, fair treatment, and my word that you won't be sent away. In exchange, you help me fix the filing error and deal with whatever Voss is doing before the claims review in 43 days. The dining room around them was not empty. Ruth was pretending to arrange things near the kitchen door. Two men at the far table were not pretending at all. Evelyn looked at Colton Hayes, but his straight, difficult face, the scar along his jaw, the hands flat on the table like a man who was presenting terms and bracing for rejection. "You said fair treatment," she said. "Yes." "What does that mean to you?" He seemed to take the question seriously, which surprised her. He thought about it for a moment. "It means I won't lie to you. It means the work of the household is shared, not yours alone. It means what I told you is what I told you, and no more and no less." He paused. "It means when someone insults you in front of me, I won't stand there." That last part landed differently than the rest. She picked up her pen, set it down again. "I want it in writing," she said. "Not the marriage, a separate agreement, the terms of our arrangement, what we each bring to it, and what we each expect from it. I've seen what happens when agreements are only verbal." Something in his face shifted. Not offense, more like the recognition of someone who has also been burned by verbal agreements and can't argue with the logic. "Fine," he said, "and I want access to the ranch's full financial records, all of them. If I'm going to help you fight this, I need to see everything Voss has his hands in." "Fine. And I need you to understand that I am not Clara." She met his eyes and held them. "I'm aware I'm not what you paid for. I'm aware that I look nothing like the photograph. I am not going to pretend otherwise or apologize for it. If that's a condition you can't accept, we should stop this conversation now." He looked at her for a long moment. "I'm not asking for an apology," he said. "I'm asking for a partner." The word partner landed in the room like something substantial. "Then we have an agreement," Evelyn said. She held out her hand across the table. He looked at it for a half-second, just long enough that she felt the awkwardness. And then he shook it. His grip was firm and brief and entirely businesslike, which was, she told herself, exactly what she'd asked for. They were married 3 days later at the county courthouse. The ceremony took 9 minutes. The judge was a thin, skeptical man named Aldrich, who read the words with the enthusiasm of someone reading a bill of lading, and the two witnesses were Ruth Alcott and Pete Greer, who had showed up wearing a jacket that had clearly not been worn in some time, and had the look of a man who had been told to look respectable and had done his best. There were no flowers. No guests beyond the witnesses. No celebration planned. When Aldrich said the words that made them legally married and looked up, Colton and Evelyn were both looking at the wall behind him with the expressions of people engaged in a serious business transaction. "You may," Aldrich started. "Yes," Colton said quickly. "Thank you, Judge." Aldrich gave him a look. Then he signed the certificate and handed it to Evelyn, who tucked it into her ledger with the careful efficiency of someone filing an important document. Outside the courthouse, Pete shook Colton's hand and said, "Congratulations, I think." And Ruth hugged Evelyn briefly and said quietly near her ear, "You watch yourself out there, and not just with Voss." Evelyn looked at her. "Hayes is a good man," Ruth said, "but he's been alone a long time. Good men who've been alone a long time can be strange about it. Don't let him off too easy, but don't expect too much too fast either." "I'm not expecting anything," Evelyn said. Ruth gave her a look that communicated, with perfect efficiency, that Ruth did not believe her. The ranch was 12 miles from town, which felt like a longer distance than it was because the road was bad, and the wagon was old, and neither of them had particularly comfortable things to say to each other. Pete drove. Colton sat in the back with Evelyn's bag, because there was no room in the front, and he had not thought ahead to arrange a better vehicle, which he was aware of, and which produced in him a specific low-grade irritation directed mostly at himself. Evelyn sat in front with Pete and asked him questions about the land. Colton watched her do it and noticed that Pete, who was not a man who warmed to people quickly, who had spent 40 years developing a surface manner best described as weatherproof, was answering her with something approaching genuine interest. She asked good questions, specific ones, about the soil near the creek, about how many head they were currently running, about what the winter had been like. "Cold," Pete said. "Was there much snow?" "Some. The south pasture held up, the north didn't. Did you lose any cattle? 4. Usually lose more. What's different about your south pasture? Pete glanced at her sideways. It's sheltered. The rise to the east cuts the wind. So the natural topography is protecting the herd. Have you ever considered building a windbreak on the north side? Even a simple board structure could... We talked about it, Pete said. Money was tight last year. What would materials cost? Maybe $40 for lumber, another $20 for the labor. And what's the value of 4 cattle? Pete was quiet for a moment. More than $60. Yes, Evelyn said. It generally is. Colton, from the back of the wagon, said nothing. He was watching a woman he had married 3 days ago ask his most trusted employee questions that he had never thought to ask, and he was having the uncomfortable experience of realizing that the silence in his life might have been something other than peace. The ranch house was not what she'd been imagining, though she hadn't let herself imagine much. It was solid. That was the first thing. The walls were real walls. The roof appeared functional. The porch was covered. It had been built by someone who understood the frontier and built accordingly. It was not comfortable. The kitchen was a room where cooking happened rather than a space where anyone had thought about what cooking was like. The main room had a table, 2 chairs, a fireplace that was clearly the primary heat source, and approximately nothing else. It was clean in the way of a space that has been cleaned functionally, but not particularly. No clutter, because there was nothing to clutter with. A minimum of everything. She stood in the middle of the main room and looked around and noticed that there was only one framed thing on any wall. A surveyor's map of the property, tacked up near the fireplace where the light hit it. Colton stood in the doorway and watched her take it in. It's not much, he said. Not apologetically, just accurately. It's solid, she said. The roof leaks in one place, northeast corner of the kitchen. I've been meaning to fix it. What stopped you? Time. And I kept hoping it would stop leaking on its own. Roofs don't generally do that. No, he said. I've noticed. She found the financial records that evening. They were in a wooden box under the kitchen table, which was not a filing system so much as evidence that someone had understood things needed to be kept somewhere and had not thought beyond that. Receipts, contracts, loan documents, tax assessments, letters from the bank, all of it loose, some of it water damaged at the edges from what was probably the leaking roof. She sorted it out on the kitchen table while Colton ate the supper Pete had made, a serviceable stew that had been on the fire since morning. And she read quietly for 2 hours. He watched her from across the table, eating, saying nothing. At some point, he refilled his coffee and set a cup in front of her without asking. She reached for it without looking up. At around 9 o'clock, she set down the last document and sat back and looked at him. How long have you been paying interest on a debt that you technically paid off 14 months ago? She said. He stopped with his coffee halfway to his mouth. What? This loan. She slid a document toward him. You made the final payment in March of last year. There should have been a release of lien filed by the bank. There isn't one. And they've been charging you continued interest on a balance that no longer exists. He put his coffee down. That's not possible, he said. I have the receipt. I know. I'm looking at it. She placed the receipt next to the loan document. The receipt is dated March 14th, 1880. The bank has been charging you monthly interest since April, 14 months of payments on a loan that was closed. He stood up. The chair scraped back hard. He leaned over the table and looked at the documents, and she watched his face cycle through 3 or 4 things in quick succession. Disbelief, comprehension, fury, before settling on a particular kind of controlled anger that was becoming familiar to her. How much? He said. She had already calculated it. Approximately $230. He straightened up. He put his hands on his hips and looked at the map on the wall for a moment, the way men look at things that aren't actually the thing they're thinking about. That's not incompetence, he said. That's not a clerical error. No, Evelyn agreed. It isn't. Voss knows. Someone at that bank certainly knows. Whether it goes directly to Voss, she paused. The pattern I described to you earlier, the other ranchers. If he's done this to multiple properties, it's systematic. It's designed to keep people financially weakened so they can't fight when he makes his move. Colton turned back to the table. He looked at her. Not past her, not through her, but directly at her, with the full weight of his attention, which she was learning was a substantial thing. "Can you prove it?" he said. "All of it. The other ranchers, the overcharges, the water rights manipulation." "I can try. I'd need access to some additional records, county filings, other loan histories if the borrowers will share them." She met his eyes steadily. "I'd need time." "You've got 41 days. "I know." He sat back down. He pulled the loan document toward him and read it again, slowly, the way a man reads something when he wants to make sure he's angry about the right thing. "Evelyn," he said, without looking up. "Yes." "The arrangement we made." He looked up now. "I want you to know, whatever happens in 41 days, with the water rights or the inheritance, I meant what I said at the courthouse. You're not going to be sent away." She looked at him across the kitchen table, in the lamplight, in the house that smelled of hay and old wood and stew. "You meant what you said about fair treatment," she said. "I meant all of it." She nodded, not warmly. She wasn't a woman who moved toward warmth quickly, and neither was he. But she nodded with a steadiness that was, in its own way, a beginning. "Then let's get to work," she said, and pulled the next document toward her. The first week on the ranch nearly broke her. Not emotionally. Evelyn had a high threshold for emotional difficulty, built up over years of being the person nobody worried about because she always managed. What nearly broke her was the physical reality of the work, which was nothing like the work she had done in Boston, and everything like something she had never imagined doing. She woke before 5 because the animals required it. She learned, badly at first and then less badly, how to work a wood stove that had opinions about being lit in cold mornings. She hauled water from the pump until her shoulders ached in a way that was new and specific and unpleasant. She cooked for 3 people on equipment that was missing half the things she would have considered basic, with supplies that had been purchased without any particular plan and stored without any particular system. Pete watched her first attempts with the careful neutrality of a man who has seen many things go wrong and has learned not to comment until asked. On the 3rd morning, when she burned the biscuits because the oven ran hotter on the left side than the right and nobody had told her, she stood at the stove for a moment with the pan of charred biscuits in her hand and said nothing. Then she set the pan down, scraped the biscuits into the scrap bucket, and started again. Pete, from the table, said, "Left side runs hot." "I noticed," she said. "Sorry, should have mentioned it." "Yes," she said, without heat. "You should have." He was quiet for a moment. Then, almost reluctantly, like a man giving up something he'd planned to keep, "The flour's in the lower bin, not the upper one. Upper one's for cornmeal. Someone switched them 3 years ago, and we never switched them back." "Why not?" He seemed to consider this. "Habit, I suppose." She filed this information and 6 other pieces of practical knowledge that Pete dispensed over the following days with the gradual tested generosity of a man deciding whether to trust someone. The water pump needed to be primed on cold mornings. The bay mare was fine unless you came at her from the left. The north fence had a weak section between posts 17 and 18, which they'd been meaning to fix since last autumn. Everything on this ranch, Evelyn said on the 5th day, looking at the list she'd been keeping, has been meaning to be fixed since last autumn. Pete looked at the list. Or the autumn before. How does anything function? Stubbornness, mostly. He thought about it. And hope. She looked at him. "Don't tell Hayes I said that," Pete said. "He hates the word hope. Makes him uncomfortable." "Why?" Pete picked up his coffee. "Because hoping means admitting something might not work out." Yeah. Colton was not avoiding her. That was what he told himself, and it was mostly true. He was busy. The ranch in late May was always demanding, and the cattle operation required attention that couldn't be postponed because a man was in the middle of rearranging his life. He worked from before dawn until after dark and came in for meals and went back out. And the arrangement had a practical logic that had nothing to do with the fact that he found the presence of another person in his house profoundly, unexpectedly disorienting. He had not lived with anyone since his uncle died 6 years ago. He had forgotten what it was like to hear someone else moving in the other room, to have the kitchen light on when he came in from the last check of the animals, to have someone look up from a table covered in papers and say, without ceremony, the stew's on the back burner and there's something I need to show you. He sat down. Both times she said it, and both times she showed him something in those documents that tightened his jaw and cost him sleep. The second thing she found was worse than the first. Do you know a man named Harlan Briggs? She said on the 6th night. He was eating. He stopped. He's a rancher, North Valley. We're not close, but I know him. He has a loan through Frontier Territorial with the same balloon provision yours has. The maturity date was last January. She looked at him over the documents. He's been paying an emergency extension rate since February. The extension rate is double the original interest. That's legal, barely. Written into the fine print in language that takes 3 readings to parse. She slid the document toward him. I got a copy from the county commercial filings this afternoon when I rode into town. He had not known she'd ridden into town. He realized, with a slight shock, that he had not been keeping track of her movements because it had not occurred to him that she would simply do things without mentioning them first. You rode in alone? He said. She looked at him. Yes? The road is long and dusty, I know. I've done it now twice. She kept her eyes on him, steady and a little waiting, in the manner of someone who has heard this kind of thing before and is deciding whether to be patient about it. Mr. Hayes, Colton. I'm 31 years old. I rode trains across half the country alone. I think I can manage 12 miles on a horse. The horse you took was... Pete showed me which one was appropriate. We discussed it. A pause. I'm not fragile. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at the document. Harlan Briggs, he said. He's not the only one. I think there are at least 4 others in similar positions. I need to talk to them. They won't talk to you. They're proud men. They don't discuss their finances. They will if you're with me. He looked up again. You're known here, she said. I'm the woman from the train station. Those are 2 very different things. But together we have credibility and information, and I think the rancher's boss has been bleeding need to understand what's being done to them before they can do anything about it. He was quiet for a moment. The lamp between them threw soft, unsteady light across the table and the papers in her face, which was tired but not defeated, and which had, he noticed, a quality of concentration that was specific to her, a kind of focused stillness that he found himself noticing more than was strictly necessary. You want to organize them, he said. I want to give them information. What they do with it is their concern. And if Voss finds out? He'll find out eventually regardless. She met his eyes. The question is whether we've built something solid enough by then to withstand it. They rode out to Harlan Briggs's place on a Saturday. It took 40 minutes, and neither of them talked much, which was comfortable in a way that surprised Evelyn. She had expected the silences to be awkward, the silences of 2 strangers who have agreed to share a life and don't know each other well enough to fill the space between them. Instead, the silence had a different texture, something more like 2 people who are thinking about the same thing. Harlan Briggs was a compact, suspicious man in his mid-50s who came to the door of his ranch house with the expression of someone braced for bad news. When he saw Colton, he relaxed slightly. When he saw Evelyn, the relaxation reversed. Hayes, he said. Who's this? My wife, Colton said. She's got something you need to hear. Harlan looked at Evelyn with the frank skepticism of a man who doesn't discuss money with women and who has strong opinions about this. Evelyn held out the copy of his loan document. You paid your extension fee in February, she said. Did you know the extension was calculated against the wrong principal balance? Harlan stared at the paper. Come inside, he said. It took 2 hours. Harlan was a methodical man. He needed to see every calculation, follow every number, argue with each conclusion before accepting it. This did not frustrate Evelyn. She'd worked with men like him in Boston, men who trusted numbers only when they'd traced each one back to its source themselves. She waited, answered questions, showed him the relevant sections of the documents, and let him work through it at his own pace. Colton, to his credit, sat back and let her lead. She noticed this. She noticed that he hadn't interrupted, hadn't explained her to Harlan, hadn't inserted himself between her and the conversation. He'd sat at the side of the room with his hat on his knee and let her do what she was there to do. When Harlan finally sat back in his chair and said, "Son of a bitch," with the particular exhaustion of a man who has just understood something expensive, Evelyn said, "Yes, exactly." "How many others?" Harlan said. "That I've confirmed. 4, including yourself and my husband. I believe there are 2 more I haven't reached yet. You think he's going to make a move before summer? The county claims review is in 35 days. After that, the water rights become considerably harder to contest. I think he's waiting for the deadline to pass so the ranchers who depend on Clearwater Creek have no legal standing to fight the change of ownership." Harlan looked at Colton. "Your water rights." "My water rights," Colton said, "but the creek feeds 4 other properties before it leaves the valley. If Voss controls it, he controls the water." Harlan was quiet for a moment with the stillness of a man understanding, for the first time, the full shape of a problem he'd only seen the edges of. "What do you need from me?" he said finally. Evelyn opened her ledger to a fresh page. "Everything," she said. "Every document related to your loan, every payment receipt, every letter from the bank. And I need you to speak to the other ranchers. They'll listen to you faster than they'll listen to us." Harlan looked at her, not with the skepticism he'd opened the door with something different, something that was the beginning of respect, delivered reluctantly, the way men like Harlan delivered everything. "You're nothing like what I heard," he said. "What did you hear?" "That Hayes got sent the wrong woman by mistake, and she talked her way into staying." "That's accurate," Evelyn said. "They said you'd be gone by the end of the month." "They were wrong about that, too." She closed the ledger. "Mr. Briggs, will you help us?" He picked up his coffee, looked at it, put it down. "Yeah," he said. "I reckon I will." The trouble with Bitter Creek was that it had ears. Everything that happened in the valley moved through the town in some form within 48 hours. Who rode where? Who visited whom? Who had been seen at the county records office asking the clerk for loan documentation in a handwriting that was not from around here? Marcus Voss heard about Evelyn's research on a Thursday afternoon from the bank's county clerk, who owed Voss a favor, and was the kind of man who paid his debts with other people's information. Voss sat behind his desk in the Frontier Territorial Bank and listened, and when the clerk finished speaking, Voss said, "Thank you, Dale," in a voice that suggested the conversation was over and the other man should leave, which Dale did, promptly and with relief. Voss picked up his pen and tapped it against the desk 3 times. He was not worried. He told himself this and believed it, mostly. The woman had found documents, which was a nuisance, but documents without legal standing were just paper. The water rights filing discrepancy was solid. He'd had his attorney verify it twice. Hayes had 41 days when this started, which was now 35. And a woman going through county records did not change the fundamental arithmetic of the situation. What bothered him, what he would not have called worry, but which kept the pen tapping, was the implication that Hayes had found someone capable of understanding what was being done to him. That was unexpected. He'd looked at Hayes, a solitary man, stubborn, hard-working, not particularly sophisticated with financial instruments. He'd sent for a mail-order bride from Boston, which was the act of a man who knew he needed something and didn't know where to find it locally. Voss had assumed the bride would be an irrelevance, decorative at best, a domestic function who would keep the house while Hayes worked himself into a corner. Instead, he had apparently acquired an accountant. Voss put down the pen. He needed to recalibrate. She was hauling water from the pump to the kitchen garden she'd started in the side yard. A practical decision, kitchen gardens paying for themselves within a season if managed correctly. When she heard the horse, she set the bucket down and turned. The man who rode up to the fence was one she didn't recognize, young and deliberate in his movements, with the air of someone delivering something he had not been asked to think about. "Mrs. Hayes?" he said. She noticed the title. It was the first time anyone had called her that. "Yes," she said. He held out an envelope. from Mr. Voss's office. She took it. He rode away without waiting for a response. She stood in the side yard with the envelope in her hand for a moment. Then she opened it. It was brief. Marcus Voss requested the pleasure of her company for tea at his offices the following Tuesday. To discuss, he wrote, certain mutual interests. The phrasing was polished and meant nothing. The intention beneath it was clear enough. He had heard what she was doing, and he wanted to look at her. She folded the letter, put it in her apron pocket, and picked up the bucket. She told Colton about it that evening. He went very still when she read it to him. The particular stillness she'd come to understand meant he was angry and was working out what kind of angry to allow himself to be. "You're not going," he said. "I haven't decided that yet." He looked at her. "Evelyn, if I refuse, he knows I'm afraid of him. If I go, I see his office, I see how he operates, and I learn something." She held his gaze. "I'm also not going to make this decision based on what you tell me to do." The statement sat between them. He opened his mouth and closed it again. He looked at the table. He rubbed the back of his neck. "He'll try to intimidate you," he said, finally. "Men have been trying to intimidate me my entire life," she said. "I'm still here." Something in his face shifted, something complicated and unresolved, and he said after a moment, "I'll come with you." "That changes the dynamic entirely." "Good." She looked at him. "Colton?" "He is not a safe man," he said, and his voice had dropped to something quieter and more serious than she'd heard from him before. "I understand you're capable. I know that. I'm not saying go with you because I think you can't manage. I'm saying it because I don't want you alone with him, and I'm asking you to let me come." The distinction landed. She looked at him for a moment, at the straight, difficult, unglamorous honesty of him, at a man who had not said, "I forbid it," or "It's not your place," but had said, "I'm asking." "All right," she said. "Tuesday, on." Monday morning, Clara Whitmore arrived on the eastbound train. Pete was in town for supplies when the train came in, and he saw her get off. A woman with 2 trunks and the face from the photograph, prettier even in person, stepping onto the platform of Bitter Creek Station with the confidence of someone arriving somewhere they intend to take over. He drove back to the ranch faster than was good for the horse. Evelyn was in the main room at the table, working. Colton was outside, repairing the section of north fence that had been on the list since last autumn. Pete came in without knocking, which he never did, and said, "Hayes needs to come in." Evelyn looked up at his face. "What happened?" "Just get him." She went to the door and called Colton's name, and something in her voice brought him across the yard faster than she'd intended. Pete told them both, standing in the middle of the main room with his hat in his hands, turning it the same way Colton did when something was wrong. When he finished, the room was very quiet. Evelyn sat back down at the table. Colton stood in the center of the room and looked at the map on the wall for a long moment. "Did she speak to anyone?" he said. "Not that I saw. She went straight to the territorial." Colton turned to look at Evelyn. She had already gone back to the documents in front of her, though he could see from where he stood that she wasn't reading them. "Evelyn," he started. "I know," she said. "She may not be here for what you think." "Colton." She looked up. Her voice was steady in the way of something held steady. "She came back because she found out about your inheritance. The same way I'd work it out if our positions were reversed." She looked at him directly. "I'm not surprised. I'm not—" She stopped for a moment. "I just need to know if it changes anything for you." He stared at her. "What?" "I need to know if she being here changes your position on our arrangement." He looked at her with an expression that was for a moment genuinely confused. Not offended, but confused. The look of a man who has been asked a question that doesn't compute. "No," he said. Just that. No elaboration, no reassurance built on top of it. Just a flat, declarative no that was somehow more convincing than anything softer would have been. She held his gaze for a count of 3. "All right," she said. "Then tomorrow we go to Voss's office as planned, and we handle Clara separately." "How?" She turned back to the documents. "I'm working on that," she said. "But..." Clara came to the ranch the next morning. She came on a horse she'd apparently borrowed from the livery, riding with the moderate competence of someone who had ridden in parks rather than on ranch roads, and she arrived at the gate looking, despite everything, like the photograph. Evelyn saw her from the kitchen window. She finished what she was doing. She was labeling the document folders she'd organized the previous night, each one corresponding to a different rancher's loan history, before she went to the door. Clara stood on the porch. She was beautiful. Evelyn had always known this, had grown up knowing it, had watched their entire lives organize themselves around it in ways both obvious and subtle. Clara was the face that made rooms rearrange themselves. She had always known her own value and had spent 24 years deciding how to spend it. She looked at Evelyn now with an expression that contained, Evelyn thought, genuine surprise. Like she had expected someone who looked beaten and found instead someone who looked busy. "You look well," Clara said. "You look exactly the same," Evelyn said. "Come in." Clara came inside and stopped in the middle of the main room, taking it in the way Evelyn had on the first day. The austerity, the map on the wall, the table now covered in organized folders, and a second ledger open beside the first. "You've been working," Clara said. "Yes." "Evelyn." Clara turned toward her and her voice shifted into something softer, something that in another context might have been called sisterly. "We should talk honestly." "I've been hoping you would." Clara met her eyes. "I made a mistake not coming. I know that now. The man has an inheritance worth—" "Don't," Evelyn said. "I'm just being—" "Clara." Evelyn's voice didn't rise, it didn't harden, it simply became very precise. "I know why you're here. I know who told you about the water rights and the inheritance. I'd guess it was Voss himself or someone connected to him, because having you here serves his purposes considerably more than yours." She let that sit for a moment. "I am married to Colton Hayes, legally. I have the certificate. I have been living here and working here for 3 weeks, and I have no intention of leaving." Clara looked at her older sister who had always been in the background, who had managed things, who had been useful and forgettable, and something moved behind her eyes that was difficult to name. "He didn't want you," Clara said, "not cruelly, just factually. He paid for me." "He married me," Evelyn said. "Those are the facts that matter now." Clara looked at her for a long moment, then she said, "You actually care about him." The observation was startlingly perceptive, coming from Clara, and Evelyn found herself with nothing immediate to say. "It doesn't matter," she said finally. "It matters to you," Clara said. "I can see it." She wasn't gloating. She seemed, if anything, slightly unsettled by what she saw. "Does he know?" "That's not your concern." Clara looked around the room again, at the ledgers, at the organized folders, at the home that had been a functional space and had been made into something that had the beginning shape of a life. "Father sent me," she said quietly. "I know. He said if I didn't come, he would have nothing." "Father always has nothing," Evelyn said. "It's his natural condition, and it has nothing to do with either of us." She looked at her sister, really looked at her, at the beautiful, limited, not entirely unkind person she had grown up alongside. "Clara, go back to Boston. Whatever Voss promised you, it isn't yours. Whatever Father wants, it isn't worth this." She paused. "You don't want this life. You never did. That's not a flaw. It's just true." Clara was quiet. Then she said, "He's going to try to have the marriage invalidated. Voss is. He's been talking to a judge." Evelyn went still. "Which judge?" "I don't know his name. Someone in the county." "How do you know this?" "Because he told me." Clara's voice was careful now. He said once the marriage was set aside, the inheritance would revert to the trust and the bank would absorb the property. He said he'd make sure I was compensated for coming out here." She paused. "I didn't understand what compensated meant until I was already on the train." Evelyn looked at her sister. "He used you," she said. "Yes," Clara said. "I think he did." The two women stood in the middle of the main room in the quiet of a Wyoming morning, and Evelyn thought about the 41 days that had become 28, and about a judge whose name she didn't know, and about Marcus Voss sitting in his office preparing to walk into the county claims review with everything arranged in his favor. "Stay for coffee," Evelyn said. Clara blinked. "What?" Stay for coffee. I want to know everything Voss said to you, exactly as he said it. Evelyn moved to the stove. I need you to be a witness, Clara. I need you to remember everything. Clara looked at her older sister, at the woman she had spent her life overlooking, standing in the kitchen of a Wyoming ranch house with the steady certainty of someone who has found the ground beneath her feet and intends to keep it. All right, Clara said, and sat down. Clara stayed for 2 hours. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup she kept forgetting to drink from, and she talked. Not easily. Clara was not a woman accustomed to being useful in this particular way, to being the person who knew something that someone else needed, but steadily, once she understood that Evelyn was genuinely listening and not preparing a counter-argument. Voss had approached her in Boston. That was the part that changed the shape of everything. Not a coincidence, not a chain of events that had simply unfolded. A deliberate approach. Through an intermediary who knew their father's social circle, who had mentioned casually at a dinner party that a young woman named Clara Whitmore had once been engaged to travel to Wyoming and had thought better of it. He knew about the arrangement before he contacted me, Clara said. He knew about the agency, about the money father used, about all of it. How? Evelyn said. I don't know. He knew. Clara looked down at her cup. He said he could offer me a resolution, that if I came back to Wyoming and testified that you had misrepresented yourself, that you had stolen my identity, essentially, a judge could invalidate the marriage. And in exchange? He said he would ensure father's debts were retired. Clara paused. And that I would receive a settlement for my trouble. Evelyn was writing in the ledger, not looking up. How much of a settlement? He said $500. She wrote the number down. Clara, she said, when he told you this, were you in his office? Yes. Was anyone else present? A man, his attorney, I think, sat in the corner and didn't speak. Do you remember the attorney's name? There was a nameplate on the desk near him. Fowler, Thomas Fowler. Evelyn wrote that down too. I need you to write out everything you just told me, Evelyn said. In your own hand, signed and dated. A statement of what Voss told you, when and where. Clara looked at her. If I do that, I know. Evelyn set down her pen and looked at her sister directly. I know what it costs you. Father will be furious. Voss will be a powerful enemy, and it doesn't give you anything, not in the short term. She held Clara's gaze. I'm asking anyway. Clara was quiet for a moment. You were always the responsible one, Clara said, not unkindly. I used to think that was simply your nature, that you didn't mind being the person who dealt with things. Father will be furious. Voss will be a powerful enemy, and it doesn't give you anything, not in the short term. She held Clara's gaze. I'm asking anyway. Clara was quiet for a moment. You were always the responsible one, Clara said, not unkindly. I used to think that was simply your nature, that you didn't mind being the person who dealt with things. I minded, Evelyn said. I just didn't say so. Something moved across Clara's face. Guilt, maybe, or the complicated grief of a person understanding something about their own history too late to undo it. Give me paper, Clara said. Colton read Clara's statement that evening by lamplight, slowly, twice. When he finished, he set it down and looked at Evelyn, who was across the table waiting with the patience of someone who has already worked through her reaction and is now waiting for someone else to work through theirs. He went to Boston, Colton said, or had someone go on his behalf. Yes. He knew about the agency, about your father. He's been planning this longer than we understood. Evelyn folded her hands on the table. The water rights claim, the loan manipulations, approaching Clara, these aren't separate schemes. They're parts of the same one. He's been building a case against you from multiple directions simultaneously. Why me specifically? There are other ranchers with water access. Because Clearwater Creek runs through your land first. Whoever controls your water rights controls the entire creek's flow downstream. The other rancher's access depends on yours. She paused. And because your uncle's will created a vulnerability with the marriage clause. Voss must have known about it. The trust is administered by his bank. He's had access to that document for years. Colton sat back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way he looked at things when he was working something out and didn't want to speak until he'd finished. "He's been waiting," Colton said, "since Douglas died, waiting for the inheritance deadline. And ensuring in the meantime that you'd be financially weakened enough to be unable to fight it." She opened the folder she'd been compiling. "I have documentation on 6 ranchers now. Harlan has spoken to the others. 4 of them have agreed to share their loan records. The pattern is consistent in every case: overcharged interest, obscured balloon provisions, and a competing water access claim filed quietly 6 weeks ago that nobody's been told about." "What does the filing do specifically?" "It argues that Voss's cattle operation has established water use rights through continuous use over the past 3 years. It's a legal theory. Thin, but not impossible if nobody contests it before the review." She met his eyes. Thin becomes strong when the opposing claimant's marriage is invalidated and his inheritance reverts to the bank. Then there's no one left to contest it. Colton picked up Clara's statement. "Read one section again." "Thomas Fowler," he said. "The attorney. I've been looking into him. He filed the competing water claim. He also filed a petition for a hearing on the marriage 3 days ago." She paused. "I found it in the county docket this afternoon." Colton's head came up. "A hearing's been filed." "Already scheduled. Judge Raymond Holt, 10 days from now." "Holt?" Colton's jaw tightened. "Holt and Voss play cards on Friday nights. I know that because Pete used to work for a man who played in the same game." "Yes," Evelyn said. "I know." He stared at her. "You know." "I've been aware of it for a week. I've also been looking into Judge Holt's property records." She opened a second folder. "He purchased a parcel of land on the east side of the valley last year. The deed of trust is held by Frontier Territorial Bank." She placed the document on the table between them. "He has a financial relationship with Voss's bank. That's a conflict of interest that should preclude him from hearing any case involving Voss." The room was very quiet. Colton looked at the document, then at Evelyn, then at the organized stack of folders on the table between them. Weeks of work, rides into town, carefully copied records, conversations with stubborn men who'd needed convincing. "Can we get him recused?" he said. "We can file for it. Whether it succeeds depends on who reviews the request." She leaned forward slightly. "But here's the thing, Colton. Even if Holt is replaced, Fowler's fraud petition has legal standing on one point. Our marriage was arranged under circumstances that could be called deceptive. The original contract was for Clara. I came instead. That is a factual irregularity that a competent attorney can work with. But we've been legally married for 3 weeks, which is not long." She looked at him steadily. "If Fowler argues in front of a sympathetic judge that the marriage was obtained by misrepresentation, it's not an automatic loss for him. We need more than the certificate. We need to show the marriage is real." Colton was quiet for a moment. "It is real," he said. "I know that," she said. "But real and legally defensible are 2 different things. We need documentation, testimony from people who have observed us living as a married couple, and we need the fraud case against Voss to be strong enough that the hearing becomes about his crimes rather than our marriage." He stood up from the table. He walked to the fireplace and stood with his back to her for a moment, which she had learned was his version of needing space to think without anyone watching him do it. "How close are you to the fraud documentation?" he said. "Close. I need 2 more ranchers' records, and I need to connect Voss directly to the overcharges. Right now I can prove the pattern, but I can't prove he ordered it. That's the gap." She paused. "And I need someone inside the bank who saw the instructions." Colton turned around. "That's a different kind of ask." "Yes." "You're talking about a bank employee coming forward against their employer, in a town where Voss employs half the people in some way." "I'm aware of that." She met his eyes. "Do you know anyone at the bank?" He thought about it. "There's a clerk, young man named Henry Adler. His father worked for my uncle years ago. We're not close, but he knows me." "Would he talk to you?" "I don't know, maybe, if he understood the situation." "Then we need to talk to him, before the hearing, before Voss has a chance to realize what we're building." She looked at the stack of folders. "We have 10 days. We need the fraud case strong enough that when we walk into that courthouse, it's Voss on trial, not me." Colton looked at her. at this woman who had arrived in his town uninvited, under the wrong name, dragging a situation created entirely by other people's failures, and who had spent 3 weeks turning that situation into something he couldn't have built alone. "All right," he said. He came back to the table and sat down. "Tell me what you need me to do, Mutt." They went to see Henry Adler on a Wednesday. Not at the bank. At his boarding house on the edge of town, in the early evening after his shift, when Colton knocked on the door with the directness of a man who doesn't pretend his visit is casual. Henry Adler was 26, thin in the way of someone who forgets to eat, with the indoor complexion of a man who spends his days under artificial light. He looked at Colton with recognition and wariness in equal measure, and at Evelyn with the particular discomfort of someone who had heard about her and hadn't formed an opinion yet. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "I heard you got married." "I did. This is my wife." Colton didn't elaborate. "Can we come in?" Henry stepped back. They sat in his small room on mismatched chairs, and Colton explained the situation plainly and without softening it, which was the only way he knew how to explain anything. When he finished, Henry was looking at the floor. "I work for that bank," he said. "I know." "If Voss finds out I talked to you, he will eventually," Colton said. "That's not the question. The question is whether what you know is worth saying before someone gets hurt by it." Henry looked up. "Someone like who?" "6 families," Evelyn said quietly. "That I can confirm. Probably more." She held his gaze. "Men who have been paying money they don't owe for loans that were quietly manipulated, who are about to lose water access they've had for years, who don't know what's happening to them because the paperwork was designed to be confusing." Henry was quiet. "I've seen the ledgers," he said finally. Very low. "At the bank. I processed the monthly statements. I noticed the discrepancy on the Hayes account 14 months ago." He stopped. "I asked Mr. Voss's manager about it. He told me it was a special accounting arrangement and that I should process the statements as written." "Did you document that conversation?" Evelyn asked. "No, I was 25 and I needed my job." "Do you remember the date?" "March. Late March last year, a Thursday." Evelyn was already writing. "Do you remember the manager's name?" "Caulfield, James Caulfield." "Is Caulfield still at the bank?" "No, he left in August. I don't know where he went." She wrote that down. "Henry, would you be willing to make a written statement about what you saw and what Caulfield told you? Signed, dated, witnessed." He looked at his hands. "And then what happens to me?" "I won't pretend it's nothing," Colton said. "Voss will know. You'll need to make a decision about what comes after." He paused. "But I can tell you that if this goes the way we're working toward, Voss won't be in a position to hurt you. And if I'm still ranching in this valley after all of this, I'll need reliable people who know what they're doing." Henry looked at him. "You're offering me a job." "I'm saying it's a possibility, if things go right. And if they don't, then we're both in trouble and we can commiserate about it." Colton's voice was flat, but there was something honest about the flatness. "I'm not going to promise you something I can't guarantee. I'm asking you to do the right thing because it's right. The rest is up to what happens." Henry sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "Give me the paper." 8 days before the hearing, Marcus Voss made a move nobody had anticipated. He came to the ranch himself. He arrived mid-morning on a Friday, alone, which was either confidence or a performance of confidence, and he rode up to the fence and waited in the particular way of a man who expects people to come to him. Colton saw him from the north pasture and walked over without hurrying. Evelyn, who had been in the kitchen working, saw the rider from the window. She recognized him. She stayed where she was for exactly 30 seconds, thinking, and then she picked up her ledger and walked out to the porch. She stood there, visible, ledger under her arm. Voss noticed her. She could see the moment he did, a small adjustment in his posture, a recalibration. "Hayes," he said, "I thought we might speak privately." "My wife is part of whatever we have to say," Colton said. "You want to talk, you talk to both of us." Voss looked at Evelyn on the porch. Something in his expression was careful, in the way of a man who has received new information and is deciding how to use it. "Mrs. Hayes," he said. The title had a quality of testing it. "Mr. Voss," she said, "you could have sent a letter. Some conversations are better in person." He looked back at Colton. "I want to be straightforward with you, Hayes. There's a hearing scheduled in 8 days. It doesn't need to happen. I'm prepared to make an offer that resolves everything without a public proceeding." "What kind of offer?" Colton said. "The bank acquires the Clearwater water rights at fair market value. You retain the ranch and the land. The inheritance transfers without contest. The hearing is withdrawn." He paused. "It's a clean resolution. Nobody loses anything significant." Colton looked at him. "Except the water." "You'd be compensated. 4 other ranching families depend on that water downstream. What happens to them in your clean resolution?" Voss's expression didn't shift. "That's a separate matter." "It's not separate to me." A silence settled between the two men. Evelyn watched it from the porch and understood what it was. Not just a disagreement about an offer, but 2 versions of how the world worked standing in the same yard and each recognizing the other clearly for the first time. "Hayes," Voss said, and his voice shifted slightly, not threatening but closer to it. "I've been patient. I've given this situation time to resolve naturally. But I want you to understand that the hearing will not go well for you. The marriage question alone is settled," Evelyn said from the porch. Voss looked at her. "The marriage is legal, documented, and witnessed," she said. She came down the porch steps and walked to where Colton stood, and she stood beside him rather than behind him. "And the fraud case that's being built against Frontier Territorial Bank and your water rights filing is considerably further along than you appear to know." Something moved behind Voss's eyes, fast, controlled. "Fraud is a serious allegation," he said. "It is. So is charging ranchers interest on closed loans. So is filing competing water claims without notifying existing holders. So is having a financial relationship with the judge scheduled to hear your case." She held his gaze without wavering. "I have documentation on all 3, Mr. Voss, and I have witnesses." The yard was very quiet. A horse shifted somewhere in the pasture. The wind moved through the grass. Voss looked at her for a long moment, the calm, measuring look of a man who has just revised his assessment of a situation he thought he controlled. "You've been busy," he said. "Yes," she said. "I have." He looked at Colton. "Your wife is ambitious." "She's thorough," Colton said. "There's a difference." Voss gathered his reins. His face had settled into a blankness that told her nothing about what he was thinking, which was more alarming than anything readable would have been. "I'll see you at the hearing," he said. And he rode away. They stood and watched him go. When he was out of sight, Colton let out a breath that told her he had been holding it for most of that conversation. "He's going to accelerate," Evelyn said. "Yeah. He'll try to do something before the hearing, file something, pressure someone, discredit the documentation." "What do we do?" She turned back toward the house. "We file for Holt's recusal today, and I need to get the complete fraud documentation to the territorial court in Laramie. If Voss influences the county process, we need someone outside his reach holding the evidence." She was already moving. "And I need you to contact Harlan and the others. They need to be at the hearing, all of them." Colton watched her walk back to the porch with the focused momentum of someone who has identified the path and is no longer uncertain about taking it. He followed her. 6 days before the hearing, Judge Holt was recused. It happened faster than either of them had expected. The recusal petition had been filed with the territorial court on the grounds of Holt's financial relationship with Frontier Territorial, and the territorial judge, a man named Carver, who was based in Laramie and had no particular relationship with anyone in Bitter Creek, reviewed it and granted the recusal within 48 hours. Voss's attorney, Fowler, filed 3 objections. All were denied. The new judge assigned to the hearing was a woman named Margaret Sands, which was unusual enough in Wyoming territory that Pete, when he heard it, said, "Well, that's something." Evelyn had done some research on Judge Sands. She had presided over 12 property disputes in 3 counties. She had a reputation for reading documents carefully and suffering neither incompetence nor manipulation gracefully. "She's fair," Evelyn said. "That's all we need." You're sure? Colton said. I'm sure we couldn't ask for more than fair. 3 days before the hearing, someone broke into the ranch house. They came in the night, while Colton and Evelyn were both sleeping, and they took nothing. Or tried to take nothing, more precisely. What they were after was in the kitchen, on the table. But Evelyn had developed a habit, in the week she'd spent building the fraud case, of never leaving all the documents in one place. The originals were in Laramie with the territorial court. The copies were split between the ranch and Ruth Alcott's back room at the territorial hotel. What the intruder found on the kitchen table were Evelyn's grocery accounts and a letter she'd been writing to Clara. Colton heard them leave. By the time he reached the main room with the rifle, they were gone, and he stood in the dark of his own house with anger that had nowhere to go and looked at the disrupted papers on the table. Evelyn came out of the bedroom 30 seconds behind him, fully dressed, except for her boots, which told him she'd been awake. The documents? He said. Safe. She looked at the table, at what had been gone through. They didn't find what they were looking for. He leaned the rifle against the wall. He looked at her, at the fact that she was dressed, that she'd been awake, that she had anticipated this. You expected this, he said. I thought it was possible. After Voss came. She pulled her boots from under the chair where she'd left them and sat down to put them on. I moved everything 3 days ago. He watched her tie her bootlace with the matter-of-fact composure of someone who has navigated difficulty before and has learned not to spend energy on reactions she can't afford. Evelyn, he said. She looked up. He sat down across from her. He put his hands flat on the table, the same way he'd done in the dining room at the Territorial 6 weeks ago when he'd made his offer. And he looked at her with an expression that was different from anything she'd seen from him before. Not the business transaction directness of the early weeks, not the focused intensity of a man solving a problem, but something more complicated and less rehearsed. I owe you something, he said. You don't... I'm not finished. He held her gaze. When you got off that train, I was cruel to you. Not because you deserved it, because I was angry about something you hadn't done and I took it out on you because you were there. He paused. I've been thinking about that for 6 weeks and I haven't said it. She looked at him across the table. I know you were angry, she said. That's not an excuse. No, but I understood it. She was quiet for a moment. I wasn't angry at you for it. I was angry at the situation. She paused. And at my father. I'm still angry at my father. Something in his face shifted. Almost a smile. Not quite, but in the direction of one. That seems fair, he said. It is fair. She looked at the disrupted papers on the table. We should get some sleep. 3 more days. Can you sleep? Probably not, but I should try. She stood up. Then, on what seemed to be an impulse she hadn't planned, she put her hand briefly on his shoulder as she passed behind his chair. Just for a second. Thank you, she said, for being here. He sat still after she'd gone back to the bedroom, in the dark of the kitchen, with the feeling of that brief weight on his shoulder, and he thought about a lot of things that he didn't have words for yet. The night before the hearing, Clara came back. She arrived at the ranch just before dark, not on a borrowed horse this time, but on the stage from town, which let her off at the end of the road and from which she walked the remaining quarter mile with her good shoes getting dusty, which told Evelyn something about the urgency. Voss went to see Fowler today, Clara said, standing in the main room, not sitting. I heard them talking. She stopped. I've been staying at the Territorial. Ruth gave me a rate. I've been listening. To what? Evelyn said. To everything. The things people say when they don't think anyone important is paying attention. She looked at Colton and then back at Evelyn. Voss is bringing a witness. Someone who's going to testify that you told them the marriage was arranged only for the inheritance. That you admitted it was fraudulent. Who? Evelyn said. Clara looked uncomfortable. He found someone who was on the train platform when you arrived, she said. One of the men who was watching when Colton told you to leave. She paused. He's going to say you made a comment to him afterward, that you said something about the money being worth the humiliation. Evelyn went very still. I didn't say that, she said. I know you didn't. I said nothing to anyone on that platform except to Colton. I know. Clara looked at her. But he's going to say you did. And people in this town already have a story in their heads about who you are. She paused. I thought you should know tonight, so you can prepare. Colton, who had been standing by the fireplace, said, Who is this man? His name is Doyle. He works at the feed store. Colton knew him. You could see it in the way his face shifted. Not surprise, but a kind of tired recognition. He owes money to the bank, of course. Yes, Clara said. I believe he does. Evelyn sat down. She thought for a moment, not in a visible, dramatic way, but in the quiet, internal manner of someone sorting through implications faster than the room could see. Then she looked at Clara. You came here to tell us this, she said. Yes. You didn't have to. No. Clara stood straight, which was something Evelyn had rarely seen from her. Not the performance of posture, but actual straightness, the bearing of a person who has made a decision. I know I didn't, but you were right about what you said. He used me, and she stopped. I let myself be used because it was easier than being honest about what I wanted. She looked at Evelyn. I didn't want to come to Wyoming. I never wanted this life, but I also didn't want to admit that you might deserve something I chose not to take. The room was very quiet. Clara, Evelyn said. Don't be gracious about it, Clara said. I can't stand it when you're gracious. Despite everything, despite the hearing in the morning and the false witness in Voss and the whole accumulated weight of the last 6 weeks, Evelyn almost laughed. All right, she said, I won't be gracious. Good. Clara picked up her bag. I'll be at the courthouse tomorrow. If you need me to say what Voss offered me, I'll say it. She walked out. Colton looked at Evelyn. Your sister, he said, with a quality in his voice that wasn't exactly admiration but was in the vicinity of it. I know, Evelyn said. You ready for tomorrow? She looked at the stack of folders on the table. At the work of 6 weeks, the records and statements and calculations and the careful, patient architecture of a case built from nothing, in a state she'd never been to, for a life she hadn't planned. Yes, she said, and she meant it. The morning of the hearing, Evelyn woke before 4. She didn't try to go back to sleep. She lay in the dark for a few minutes, listening to the sound of the ranch, the wind, the horses, the particular quality of silence that belonged to this place and nowhere else. And then she got up, dressed in the best thing she owned, and went to the kitchen. Colton was already there. He was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking, staring at nothing in particular, and when she came in, he looked up with the expression of a man who had also not slept and wasn't going to mention it. She went to the stove without speaking and made a second cup and set it in front of herself and sat across from him. They sat like that for a while. Not uncomfortably. Two people who had learned over 6 weeks of close and difficult proximity that silence between them didn't need to be filled. How do you feel? He said eventually. Nervous, she said. You? Same. He looked at his coffee. I'm not good at things like this. Rooms full of people watching, talking in front of a judge. You don't have to do much talking. I know, that's almost worse. He paused. I'm better when I can do something. You've been doing things for 6 weeks, she said. Today is just the day they count. He looked at her across the table in the early morning dark and said nothing for a moment. Then, whatever happens in there, I want you to know that the last 6 weeks, he stopped. Started again, more carefully. I've been wrong about a lot of things. What I thought I needed, what I thought mattered. I sent for a face in a photograph because I thought that was the practical choice, and I told myself I wasn't being foolish when I was being exactly that. He held her gaze. What I needed was someone who would stay when everything was falling apart. I didn't know to ask for that. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Colton, she said. Ask me. He blinked. Ask me to stay, she said. Not for the ranch. Not for the water rights or the inheritance or any of the rest of it. Ask me because you want me to. The kitchen was very quiet. Stay, he said. Just that, low and direct and completely without performance. All right, she said. She picked up her coffee. He picked up his. They drank in the quiet of the morning, and neither of them said anything else, and it was enough. The Bitter Creek courthouse held perhaps 60 people at capacity. By the time Colton and Evelyn arrived, 40 minutes before the scheduled start, it was already nearly full. Word had moved through the valley the way word always moved through Bitter Creek, faster than was comfortable, and with more detail than anyone had officially shared. The ranchers were there, Harlan Briggs in the second row with his hat in his lap, and the expression of a man who has come prepared to be angry, two others she recognized from her visits to their properties. A fourth she hadn't met who had apparently heard about it from Harlan and decided to come anyway. Ruth Alcott was near the back, spine straight, arms folded, looking like a woman keeping score. Clara sat on the left side of the room, apart from everyone, in a way that was either deliberate or the result of nobody being certain how to place her. Marcus Voss was already at the front, at the respondents' table, with Thomas Fowler beside him, and two other men she didn't recognize, but whose suits suggested they were from somewhere larger than Bitter Creek. He looked at Evelyn when she came in with the assessment of a man reading a document for weaknesses. She looked back with the steadiness she had spent 31 years developing. Henry Adler was in the third row, looking like he might be sick. Evelyn caught his eye briefly. He nodded, once, tight. They sat down at the petitioner's table with their attorney, a man named George Pratt, whom Evelyn had contacted in Laramie 3 weeks ago, who had the unremarkable appearance of someone who saves his impressiveness for courtrooms. Pratt leaned over. "You have everything?" "In order," Evelyn said. She placed the document folders on the table in the sequence she'd prepared. 6 weeks of work, organized into 40 minutes of evidence. Judge Margaret Sands entered the room at precisely 9 o'clock. She was in her 50s, gray-haired, with the bearing of a woman who had spent 20 years in rooms where people expected her not to be in charge and had stopped finding it interesting. She sat, looked at the room, looked at the papers in front of her, and said, "Let's begin." Fowler opened the fraud petition with the confidence of a man who believes the outcome is already arranged. He argued, cleanly and with reasonable legal craft, that the marriage between Colton Hayes and the woman presenting herself as a bride had been established under materially false pretenses. The contract, he said, had been for Clara Whitmore, age 24 of Boston. The woman who had arrived was Evelyn Whitmore, age 31, who had not been party to any agreement and who had inserted herself into the arrangement without the knowledge or consent of the contracting party, that is, Colton Hayes. He paused there for effect. He then produced his witness. The man named Doyle was perhaps 40, weathered, with the look of someone who hadn't slept well, and was finding the room more public than he'd prepared for. He sat in the witness chair and answered Fowler's questions with a specificity that had the feeling of rehearsal. The exact words, the exact sequence, the studied recall of a man repeating what he'd been told to say. He claimed that on the day of Evelyn's arrival at Bitter Creek Station, she had spoken to him on the platform after Colton walked away, that she had said, in words he quoted directly, that the money made the humiliation worth it. Evelyn wrote 2 words in her ledger, wrong platform. Pratt stood up for cross-examination. "Mr. Doyle," he said, "you said Mrs. Hayes spoke to you on the platform." "That's right." "Which end of the platform were you standing on?" A pause. "The north end, near the baggage." "And Mr. Hayes, where did he walk when he left?" "Toward the street, south end." "So after Mr. Hayes walked south, Mrs. Hayes, who had just arrived, who had never been to Bitter Creek, who had no idea where anything was, walked north to the baggage area and approached a stranger and made this comment?" Doyle's jaw tightened. "That's what happened." "Did you know each other? Had you met before?" "No." She approached a complete stranger, on a platform she'd never been on, in a direction opposite to where she was going, to make a comment to someone she'd never met. Pratt's voice stayed even. "Did you tell anyone about this comment at the time?" Pause. "No." "Did you mention it to anyone in the days following?" "No." "When did you first report this to Mr. Fowler's office?" Longer pause. "Last week." "Last week, more than 6 weeks after the event." Pratt set down his papers. "How much does your ranch owe to Frontier Territorial Bank, Mr. Doyle?" Fowler was on his feet. "Objection." The witness's financial relationship to the respondent is directly relevant to his credibility, Pratt said to Judge Sands, without raising his voice. Judge Sands looked at Doyle. Answer the question. Doyle looked at Voss. It was a fast look, involuntary, the look of a man checking what he's allowed to say. Judge Sands saw it. Everyone in the room saw it. Mr. Doyle, she said, with a patience that had teeth in it. Look at me, not at Mr. Voss. Answer the question. About $400, Doyle said quietly. Due when? Pratt asked. End of the month. The room shifted, not loudly, a collective, barely audible exhalation, 60 people recalibrating what they were watching. Pratt sat down. Doyle was excused. Pratt then called Henry Adler. Henry sat down in the witness chair with his hands on his knees and the look of a man who has made a decision and is living in the 30 seconds after it, when the decision is final but the consequences haven't arrived yet. He told the truth. He told it plainly, in the specific, detailed language of someone who processes financial documents and has a precise memory for numbers and dates. He described the Hayes account discrepancy he'd identified in March of the previous year. He described his conversation with James Caulfield, the manager, and what Caulfield had told him. He named the other accounts he had seen with similar patterns, not from memory, but from a written record he had quietly kept, for reasons he said he wasn't entirely sure of at the time, but which he understood now to be a form of self-protection. Evidence that he had raised a concern and been told to ignore it. Fowler's cross-examination was aggressive and went nowhere useful. Henry had the defensive advantage of simply telling the truth, which is difficult to shake loose from a person who isn't embellishing. When Henry stepped down, Evelyn looked at him as he passed their table. He didn't smile, neither did she. But something passed between them. The acknowledgement of two people who have done something that cost them something and have decided it was worth it. Then Pratt called Evelyn herself. She had not been nervous about testifying. She was nervous now, sitting in the witness chair with 60 people looking at her, and she acknowledged it to herself without letting it reach her face. Pratt took her through the events methodically. Her father, the arrangement, the train, the platform, the 3 weeks on the ranch, the documentation she had compiled. He was careful to establish each element cleanly, without dramatics, letting the sequence speak for itself. She answered every question the same way, directly, accurately, without embellishment. When Fowler cross-examined her, he tried 3 different angles. He tried to frame her arrival as calculated deception. She explained calmly that she had told Colton the truth on the platform within 60 seconds of meeting him, which was not the behavior of someone trying to deceive. He tried to argue that her financial work on the ranch was evidence of ulterior motive. She pointed out that uncovering fraud was not generally considered a suspicious activity. He tried to suggest the marriage was purely transactional. She looked at Fowler and said, "Most marriages begin with some practical element. Whether they become something more than that is determined by the people in them, not the paperwork." The room was quiet. Judge Sands looked at her over the papers, not warmly exactly, but with something that was the judicial equivalent of a nod. Fowler sat down. Then Pratt called Colton. Colton Hayes was not a man built for courtrooms. He sat in the witness chair with the rigid discomfort of someone whose body knows it belongs outdoors, and he answered Pratt's early questions with the minimum number of words that technically constituted answers. Then Pratt asked, "Mr. Hayes, on the day your wife arrived at Bitter Creek Station, you told her to leave on the next train. Is that correct?" "Yes." "And she didn't leave?" "No." "Why do you think that is?" Colton was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands, then out at the room, and his eyes found Evelyn at the table. "Because she had nowhere to go," he said, "and because she wasn't a woman who gave up just because someone told her to." He paused. "I told her to leave because I was angry, and I was wrong. She was the only honest person in that whole arrangement, and I treated her like she was the problem." The room was very still. "Mr. Hayes," Pratt said, Judge Sands will be asked to determine whether your marriage has legal standing. In your view, is your marriage real? Colton looked at Evelyn. Yes, he said. Can you tell the court why? He was quiet for a moment, not because he was searching for words, but because he was being careful with them, which was a different thing. Because real isn't about how it started, he said. Real is about what it turns into when things get hard. She found the fraud nobody else found. She wrote out to ranchers who wouldn't have talked to her and made them understand what was being done to them. She fixed things on that ranch that had been broken for years, and she did all of it without asking for credit or thanks. He paused. A woman does that alongside you. That's not a transaction. I don't know what else to call it, except real. Someone in the back of the room, Evelyn did not look to see who, made a sound that was the involuntary audible version of feeling something. Fowler declined to cross-examine. The fraud documentation came last. Pratt submitted it as a package. All 6 ranchers' accounts, the pattern analysis Evelyn had compiled, Henry's testimony, Clara's signed statement about Voss's offer, the land deed showing Judge Holt's financial relationship with Frontier Territorial, and the water rights filing discrepancy with the corrected documentation that Pratt had filed with the court the previous week. It was 47 pages. Judge Sands read the summary while the room waited. Voss sat at his table with the stillness of a man who has looked at the board and understands the game has changed, but is not yet ready to accept it. Fowler leaned over and said something to him, quietly. Voss didn't respond. Clara, in her seat on the left side of the room, was watching her sister with an expression that Evelyn would not see until later, when Ruth described it to her. The expression, Ruth said, of someone watching a person they underestimated their whole life and feeling the full specific weight of having been wrong. Judge Sands set down the document summary. I have several observations, she said, in the tone of a woman who does not require silence but will obtain it. The room gave it to her immediately. The petition to invalidate the marriage of Colton and Evelyn Hayes is denied. She said it first, before anything else, without preamble. The marriage was legally performed, legally witnessed, and has been maintained in good faith. The circumstances of its arrangement, while irregular, do not constitute fraud under territorial law. The petitioner's own witness has demonstrated credibility issues that I will note in the record. Fowler started to rise. Mr. Fowler, I'm not finished. He sat. Regarding the water rights claim filed by Frontier Territorial Bank on behalf of its principals, that claim is rejected as procedurally deficient and substantively unsupported. The original Hayes water rights, once the filing error is corrected, which I'm ordering the county clerk to process today, will be restored and properly recorded. Voss's face did not change. That was the thing about men like him. They'd spent years learning not to let their faces change, but his hands, flat on the table, pressed down slightly, a small, involuntary pressure. Furthermore, Judge Sands continued, the documentation submitted by the petitioner's own wife, by Mrs. Hayes, regarding the financial practices of Frontier Territorial Bank has been forwarded to the Territorial Court in Laramie. This is not within my jurisdiction to adjudicate today, but I want it on the record that I consider the evidence credible, systematic, and serious, and that I expect a full investigation to follow. She looked at Voss directly. Mr. Voss, I've practiced law in this territory for 22 years. The thing about schemes built on many small pieces is that they seem manageable until someone puts all the pieces on one table. She looked down at the 47 pages in front of her. Someone did that. She closed the folder. We're adjourned. What? The room took a moment to understand what had happened, the way rooms do when the outcome is different from what they'd been told to expect. Then it became loud all at once. Harlan Briggs reached across the row and shook the hand of the rancher next to him. Ruth stood up from her seat in the back. Henry Adler put his face in his hands for a moment. Relief, probably, or the aftermath of sustained terror, or both. Clara did not move immediately. She sat still while the room moved around her, and then she stood and walked toward the front, and when she reached Evelyn, she stopped. They looked at each other. Well, Clara said. Yes, Evelyn said. Clara looked like she had more to say and couldn't find the beginning of it. She opened her mouth, closed it. "I'm going back to Boston," she said finally. "I'm going to tell Father what happened." "He won't be pleased." "No, but someone has to tell him the truth, and it may as well be me." She looked at Evelyn with an expression that had shed all its usual self-possession and was just a person's face. "I'm sorry for not coming in the first place, for all of it." "I know," Evelyn said. "Are you—" Clara stopped. "Are you happy? Here?" Evelyn looked at the question honestly, the way she looked at everything. "Not yet," she said. "But I think I'm going to be." Clara nodded. Something in her posture relaxed, like a weight she'd been carrying had been acknowledged, even if not fully set down. Then Voss walked past them. He was leaving with Fowler, moving through the thinning crowd with the deliberate pace of a man who refuses to be seen hurrying. When he reached the door, he stopped, and he turned, and he looked at Evelyn with an expression that was not anger exactly, but was its cousin. The look of a man who is lost and knows it, and has not yet decided what to do with that knowledge. "You're thorough, Mrs. Hayes," he said. "I'll give you that." "Thank you," she said. "It's what my father always said was my least interesting quality." Something shifted in his face. Then he walked out. Colton found her onto the courthouse steps. The crowd was dispersing around them, voices moving down the street, the particular noise of people who have witnessed something and are already turning it into a story they'll tell. He came and stood beside her, and they looked out at Bitter Creek together, at the dry Main Street, the low buildings, the wide sky above everything that Wyoming had, and no other place she'd been had in quite the same way. "It's over," he said. "The hearing is," she said. "The Laramie investigation will take months." "I know, but the ranch is ours." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to fix the north fence this week." She looked at him. "It's been on the list since last autumn," he said. "Since the autumn before," she said. "Right." He looked at her sideways. "I thought maybe you'd help." "I don't know anything about fences." "I'll show you." She looked back out at the street, at Ruth crossing toward them with the expression of a woman who has things to say and is deciding which one to lead with. At Harlan Briggs shaking Pete's hand near the horses, two men of few words finding a moment sufficient for what it needed to be. "Colton," she said. "Yeah." "When we fixed the filing error on the water rights, did you know the renewal was due again in 6 months?" He stared at her. "I just want to make sure we don't miss it," she said. He made a sound that was unmistakably a laugh. Short, surprised, genuine. The laugh of a man who has forgotten he knows how to do it. He covered it quickly with the serious expression of someone who does not laugh in public if he can help it, but it had been there. "No," he said. "I didn't know. I'll put it in the ledger." "Of course you will." Ruth reached them. She put her hand on Evelyn's arm and said, "Well done," in a tone that did not invite argument or expansion, because the words were sufficient. "I had help," Evelyn said. "You built it," Ruth said. "There's a difference." She looked at Colton. "Your wife is remarkable. I thought you should know in case nobody's told you." "I know," Colton said. Ruth looked between them with the satisfaction of a woman who sees what she expected to see and finds it gratifying. Then she walked away without another word, because she was Ruth Alcott, and she knew when a moment belonged to other people. They rode back to the ranch in the early afternoon. Not in the wagon this time. On horseback, side by side, on the road that Evelyn had now ridden so many times, she knew where each rut was and which section flooded when it rained hard. The land looked different in June than it had in May. Drier, yellower at the edges, the grass moving in the steady wind that never fully stopped out here. She had stopped thinking of it as landscape. It had become, somewhere in the last 6 weeks without her specifically deciding, something closer to home. "Pete's going to want to celebrate," Colton said. "He'll make that stew." "He makes that stew for everything." "It's a good stew." "It's an adequate stew." Colton paused. "Don't tell him I said that." "I won't." She watched the road ahead. "We should have Harlan and the others out sometime, once things settle." "A dinner? Or just supper? Nothing formal." She glanced at him. This valley is going to be different now without Voss operating the way he was. The ranchers are going to need to work together more, share information. It would be easier if they knew each other. He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was taking the idea seriously rather than deflecting it. "You'd organize it," he said. "Someone should." "Yeah." He looked at her. "Yeah, all right." They rode the rest of the way mostly in silence, which was comfortable in the deep and specific way of a silence shared by two people who know each other well enough that it doesn't need filling. The ranch came into view around the last bend, the solid house, the barn, the north pasture where the fence still needed fixing. The kitchen garden on the side, which had been struggling in the early weeks and was now, against reasonable expectation, actually producing something. Nothing about it was beautiful in the way that photographs were beautiful. It was functional and imperfect and weathered by years of hard use and hard weather. The porch boards were uneven. The barn needed paint. The roof still leaked in the northeast corner of the kitchen, though Colton had gotten up there twice now, and it was, at least, leaking less. It was the most real place Evelyn had ever been. She dismounted at the gate and led the horse through, and when she reached the porch, she stopped and looked back at the view. The wide, indifferent, enormous Wyoming sky. The land that didn't care about her feelings. The valley that had watched her arrive as the wrong woman and had made room for her anyway. She thought about her mother, who had said the worst thing a person could do was mistake comfort for safety. She thought about the train platform, 6 weeks ago, where she had stood with her single bag and her composure and the loud, small laughter of people who had already decided she didn't matter. She thought about 31 years of being background, of being useful and forgettable and managed, of being the one who stayed. She had stayed here too, but this time it had been her choice. Colton came up beside her. He looked at what she was looking at, the valley, the sky, the ordinary, imperfect working life of the place. "You're thinking," he said, constantly. "About anything specific?" She considered it. "About the fact that I came here with nothing," she said. "No real name in the arrangement, no welcome, nothing guaranteed." She paused. "And I stayed anyway, and it turned into something." "It did," he said. "That's not nothing." She looked at him. "I think people underestimate how much is possible when you stay." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, with the careful deliberateness of a man who does not do things impulsively, but does them fully when he decides to, he reached over and took her hand. Not dramatically, not as a gesture for anyone to see. Just his hand around hers, solid and warm and entirely serious, the way he did everything. She looked down at their joined hands. Then she looked back out at the valley. "The fence," she said. "Tomorrow," he said. "And the roof." "Next week." "And the renewal